Ladies and gentlemen, Robin Harris.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, as you pointed out, my book is on sale. Very much reduced price. It's a very large book, full of interesting things, most of them accurate. This book, though, of course, it covers the history of the Conservative Party over more than 2 centuries. And Europe comes in and out of that story, but it isn't and it couldn't be a continuous theme. There are, though, 2 relevant strands of continuity that I would bring to your attention. And the first lies in the party itself. Now, the epithets that best apply to the Conservatives over their long history seem to me to be successful, necessary, and surprising, but also ruthless, opportunistic, and sometimes short-sighted. Now, that judgment is relevant, I think, to how we consider the party's attitude to Europe. The second strand of continuity is the concept of national interest. A Conservative leader who argued that a particular policy needed to be followed because it was moral or enlightened or just or whatever, but who didn't mention if it was in the national interest or not, would traditionally be given very short shrift from fellow Conservatives. For Conservatives, however much we may disagree quite sharply about details, the national interest comes first. Now, this is a really big difference between us and the left. And by the left, of course, I also include Liberal Democrats. So what has been and what is British national interest in Europe? Well, without going back too far, but still going back rather further than the origins of the Conservative Party under Peel, I think we can see that British policy is traditionally hostile to any one power dominating continental Europe. That hostility from the 17th to the early 19th centuries was largely directed at France. But from about the 1830s, which is the beginning of what we might call the high point of British global greatness, until about the 1930s, that's a century or so later, Britain's view was modified. Britain, during this period, still preferred to see a balance of power in Europe, but this wasn't primarily to preserve its own security. It was primarily with a view to securing our empire. Britain had, by this stage, achieved all that it was likely to achieve, and knew it. Indeed, it suffered from a degree of overstretch. What Britain now disliked were therefore dissatisfied, hungry European powers. And we feared more those, of course, whose hunger was combined with strength. Under Lord Salisbury, for example, Britain's closest, though never our formal ally, was Bismarck's Germany, which was dominant in Europe, but which after the Franco-Prussian War was also a satisfied power. By contrast, Britain feared Russia because of threats to the Near East and ultimately India, but also because Russia was a dissatisfied, hungry power. The Second World War and the Cold War again changed these calculations in various respects, and ultimately, therefore, changed the way in which the British viewed continental Europe. On the eve of the Second World War, British policy was still preoccupied with empire. In the 1930s, the temptation was particularly powerful for the Conservatives because we were so obsessed with imperial preference and imperial integration. And the temptation resulted in a degree of failure to react and to realize the full significance of the rise of the European dictators, above all, of course, the rise of Hitler. Now, this was partly the result of adherence to old ways of thinking. It was partly the result of a failure of leadership. And Churchill sums up some of this, I think, in an interesting manner in his assessment of Stanley Baldwin. And the comparison that Churchill is making is with Neville Chamberlain. Stanley Baldwin, writes Churchill, was the wiser, more comprehending personality, but without executive capacity. He was largely detached from foreign and military affairs. He knew little of Europe and disliked what he knew. He had a genius for waiting upon events. Now, this is a very conservative attitude, and frequently a disastrous one. It wasn't, of course, Chamberlain's. Neville Chamberlain was an activist. Chamberlain thought he understood Europe. In particular, Chamberlain thought that he understood Hitler. Although Chamberlain began rearmament, he still thought that influence was a substitute for power, and that a sound economy was more important than a substantial army. Now, it's wrong, of course, to focus the spotlight solely on the conservatives in the 1930s. Socialism and pacifism had eroded the national psyche, making arguably a robust defense strategy at certain periods almost impossible. Moreover, America had, by this point, overtaken Britain in the great power stakes, and America was pursuing a policy of isolation and continued to do so until Pearl Harbor stopped that. Well, with the end of the Second World War and the drawing across of the Iron Curtain, a new set of circumstances forced a new appraisal. The Cold War required that America, and in America's slipstream, as it were, Britain, should ensure that Western Europe stayed secure and that it should become prosperous. NATO provided part of the answer, but the Marshall Plan and then the various initiatives which resulted in the European Common Market provided the other part. Churchill's not very coherent enthusiasm for European unity, though a unity, of course, which he always regarded as excluding Britain, must be fitted into this wider pattern. The German question was particularly crucial, and solving it meant concessions to France. The United States wanted German rearmament, particularly once the Korean War had begun in 1950. And America accordingly pressed for a European army under the umbrella of what was called the European Defence Community. This umbrella had largely been raised in order to please the French, but in the event it was the French who rejected the whole thing and pulled it down. Well, anyway, it's sometimes said that Britain missed the boat, failing to get on board the European venture at the right time and in the right conditions. But we simply have to remember that various boats or vessels appeared and a number of them sunk. Britain's error, for which the Foreign Office complacency must mainly take the blame, was in failing to see just how strong the drive for European unity was among the European elite, and above all, particularly at the Messina Conference in 1955, and also for failing to understand how much pressure would come from the United States to go along in this direction. Under both Ernest Bevin and Anthony Eden as foreign secretaries in the post-war period, British policy had been fairly consistently opposed to any involvement with supranational, as opposed to international institutions. But for both France and Britain, the turning point was Suez, 1956. In France, even before de Gaulle's victory 2 years later, the politicians of the Fourth Republic had become thoroughly disgusted with America and distrustful of Britain because of events in the Middle East. In Britain, arguably, the shift was even more significant. Eden's replacement by Macmillan represented the imposition of Eisenhower's favourite British politician, who was also by temperament and preference a progressive. And once entry into the common market became associated with progress, Macmillan would press for it. And Washington then pressed Macmillan harder even than he wished to go. Now there's no need to run through all the negotiations, the ones that failed or even those that finally succeeded, but I really want to make 3 points. First, the concept of a European free trade area. It was never seriously developed. And when people say that it failed, it would be more accurate to say that it was never properly tried. The free trade area idea was first devised as a means of watering down the imminent decision of the Six to set up a common market. And it had no real chance of doing that. It was too late in the day, and it didn't offer the French what they wanted, i.e. protection. And when the EE6 went ahead, the EFTA 7 was set up almost as an act of pique. From the very start, British government ministers and officials thought poorly of it. The Americans also, be it noted, disliked it, precisely because it didn't have those supranational institutions which the Americans wanted to see as the core of a politically united Europe, and they thought that EFTA was a spoiling device, and I suppose in some sense it was. Macmillan, for his part, worried that Britain was excluded from the most rapidly growing European markets. But above all, he worried that the US would take notice of the Six and wouldn't take notice of Britain, and thus wouldn't take notice of him. Well, EFTA was, in fact, hardly created before Macmillan was already trying, with support significantly now from British industrialists, to get back into negotiating entry into the EEC. Well, my second point relates to what this European Economic Community that Britain finally joined in 1973 actually was and is. Well, throughout this early period, and much later when this was completely inexcusable, the attempt was made by the political elite, and especially the Conservative Party political elite, to portray Europe, as I must now call it, as something quite different from what it in fact was. The conception behind it, the conception of Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman and others, was not of a free trade area. It was of a series of interlocking cartels, beginning with the coal and steel cartel or community of 1951, then forming a customs union organized by central institutions and, of course, finally with its own system of law. And that is what the Treaty of Rome established, and it is what subsequent treaties and other developments have reinforced. Its purpose was to create a real union of European countries, particularly a union between France and Germany, such that war was impossible because national sovereignty would be suppressed. Its goal was the creation of a kind of, one has to use that expression, a kind of United States of Europe. But this goal would be advanced on an apparently ad hoc and pragmatic basis. The assumption, and one can hardly fault it, was that unity was more likely to flow from practical cooperation rather than through declaring too vocally what was really planned. And looking at Europe today, we can say that in this sense, if no other, that plan has worked. Well, not surprisingly, the Six, even before de Gaulle's arrival, were unconvinced that Britain would fit into this conception. America, by contrast, with its political tradition of universalism, its distrust of nation states, and of course its visceral dislike of the European colonial empires, and now much, much more worried by the costs of the Cold War, thought otherwise. And so the US pushed and pushed and pushed us in, and in we went. Well, when one examines the internal British debates about all this, one is struck, I think, by one enormous omission. The Heath government spent far more time discussing details of access for Commonwealth produce than it ever did the financial terms of British membership. And it spent no time at all debating the loss of sovereignty, which it first publicly denied and later more or less accepted, but simply redefined, notably by trying to claim that sovereignty was nothing other than power, which of course is a nonsense. The central error in Britain, though, was to regard as a question of foreign and commercial policy, and that is of external relations, what was in fact an internal question of government as such. In other words, the creation of a new legal and political order. The Treaty of Rome represented, as we can now see, the enactment of nothing less than a constitutional revolution. How did it happen? Well, there are several aspects to this, but the one that really concerns us today, I think, is the role of the Conservative Party and its leadership. And this is my third and last point. I confess that I am intrigued that David Cameron so venerates Harold Macmillan. This veneration has also since been echoed by others who apparently think my book is unfair to Macmillan. But in retrospect, I don't think I was critical enough. Macmillan, we should recall, hailed not just from the left of the Conservative Party, but ideologically speaking from the left of the whole British political spectrum. His whole political career indeed shows it. Now, he has some achievements to his name, notably repairing the broken relationship with the United States after Suez, and, more palpably, winning a landslide election with a more than 100-seat majority in 1959. But from the time that Macmillan came in through treachery, and the time he went out amid deceit, he did a huge amount of harm. The most significant aspect of this harm was in the obsession with Europe. It was Macmillan who created the impression that Europe was the answer to every problem rather than the source of new problems. And it was Macmillan's closest disciple, Edward Heath, who then so attached the Conservative Party to the European cause that dissidents were silenced or bypassed or effectively expelled, and that even his successors, even Mrs. Thatcher until near the end of her term in office, continued to mouth the required European pieties. Macmillan and Heath were by instinct and conviction collectivists and internationalists. Collectivism and internationalism are fundamentally at odds with any genuine philosophical conservatism. In this sense, the Conservative Party still pays the price of its own and its leaders' past failure to be conservative. And there is, of course, a rather delightful poetic justice in that, but it doesn't help us, it doesn't help the Conservative Party, and it certainly doesn't help Britain today. Well, the chance to break out of this national and Conservative Party cul-de-sac was offered by Mrs. Thatcher's Bruges speech in 1988, in which I had a hand, or at least perhaps a finger and a half. The Bruges model of a Europe of freely cooperating sovereign states, linked by trade but without a single currency, was and is a practical, coherent, and persuasive one. It is liberal and it is democratic, which the alternative wasn't and isn't. Now, arguably, the Bruges model should be nearer fulfillment now than at any time since Maastricht, given the failure of the Eurozone. But somehow I doubt whether any idea made in Britain is going to be acceptable in Paris and Berlin. If it does happen, it will happen quite simply by default. The interesting historical question, or at least I find it interesting and I hope you will, is why Bruges at the time didn't gain traction before the Delors plan swept everything else before it. Well, I think there are several reasons, and again, they should make us reflect on current circumstances. Bruges came too late in the Thatcher premiership, when others were already plotting her downfall, and when the economy and later the poll tax were turning everything sour. As the song goes, I remember it well. It was sprung on the party with no proper discussion of how and why the European model had failed. Of course, this discussion, we should recall, had been effectively banned since 1975 and the referendum campaign. Importantly, President Ronald Reagan was leaving office at the time. The US State Department was thus able to resume its old, ultimately self-destructive drive for further European integration. Moreover, I think with the end of the Cold War and the emergence of new states from old, there was simply too much on the geopolitical agenda. Though in fact, the Bruges approach was precisely what the post-Cold War world should have adopted, but didn't. I also believe that the departure of Mrs. Thatcher allowed the Conservative Party to revert to its old ways. Now, people remember and talk a great deal about the splits and the rows under John Major. Again, I remember it well. But I think that more harmful was simply what I would have to call the end of thought. The Conservative Party's besetting sin, in the end, is sloth. And the party became, once again, intellectually lazy. And at the top, it still is. It is reactive, incoherent, unprepared, and strategically timid, even though on occasion tactically bold or even rash. Now, I'm sure that Simon Heffer will provide a much better analysis of the present position than I can. But I personally am struck by the continuing intellectual failure of the leadership to come to grips with what is actually happening in Europe. I mean, we're seeing at one and the same time both the fulfillment and the implosion of what was planned by the Euro ideologues. A utopian experiment has been tested to destruction in the form of the unworkable Eurozone, and the destruction is indeed what we are seeing. Britain is, in historical terms, and from an historic perspective, again, I would say, faced by a dissatisfied, hungry power that dominates Europe. But worse, this time round, it is an unstable, failing power that threatens both its subjects and its neighbours. Now, Britain's goal in this circumstance should surely be to keep out of the mess, get out of old arrangements which never work to our interests, and avoid new ones that certainly never will in the future. Public opinion has surely, again, we can hardly doubt, but some elevated people seem unable to grasp, public opinion has shifted radically against Europe. A new Conservative agenda based on less government, low taxes and national independence seems to me to have been written more or less already in the Tory press. And a referendum or even an early election, well, it might destroy the coalition, but it could also give the Conservative Party a majority and even, who knows, the chance to be Conservative, if that's not too frightening a prospect. So we need a Conservative rethink. Above all, we need to think as Conservatives. I wonder if we still can. I hope so.